Thanks for listening to this Voice of San Diego podcast. If you like what you hear and want more news like this, sign up for the Morning Report. That's our most popular newsletter. We send it out every weekday. Just visit voiceofsandiego.org and click on the newsletter tab. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Voice of San Diego podcast in partnership with News Radio Kogo. I'm Andrew Keatts, assistant editor at Voice, and you are hearing me instead of Scott Lewis because he is not here, but I am instead joined by my good friend, Sara Libby, managing editor at Voice.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing great.
It's just the two of us this week.
I know, it's great.
It is way better.
I want to point out that there's a note in our script that says, even with Scott gone, we'll still have a good show this week. And I would like to edit that aggressively to because Scott is gone.
Especially due to Scott's absence, this show will finally be good.
Exactly. That's a great lead.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. So we've got a couple things we want to get through this episode. We are going to bring in Maya Srikrishnan in the second half of this show. She has been in Honduras for a week reporting on the migrant crisis from there, from the area that many of those caravans have begun.
Kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal. She's going to talk to us about her time down there. So we'll get into the Duncan Hunter debacle. There have been yet another round of shakeups at Lincoln High. We learned a lot more about a pretty far-reaching scandal, fraud being perpetuated at a charter school here in town. But before we get to all that, Sarah, tell me, do you have anything big coming up? Is there anything in your life happening in the next few days?
Yeah, it's my birthday on Saturday.
And you're one of these people who, like, for whom that's a big deal. You care about that. That matters.
Yeah, well, so I want to get into that.
Yeah.
Because the following day is Father's Day, which would apply to you.
Correct.
And I understand that you don't enjoy doing things or acknowledging special days in any way.
There's no individualized day that I care about.
Got it. So you're doing nothing.
No, we won't do anything.
Okay. Great.
We're not going to do anything. But like I like 4th of July.
Uh-huh.
Thanksgiving's like my favorite day of the year. I love Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving's the best holiday.
Yeah. A lot of people think that New Year's Eve is overrated. I do not agree. I like New Year's Eve quite a bit.
Oh, I don't like it.
I enjoy celebrating it, and I enjoy the spirit of it. These sorts of like days for everybody, I'm into those.
Okay.
Days for individuals, I steadfastly oppose.
Well, I disagree mostly on a food basis. So
Yeah.
I want to embrace anything that gives me the opportunity to eat amazing food.
But here's what I don't understand. Like that is
just
why
go with it.
But that's why birthdays are great for kids, because it's like I get cupcakes today. Normally I don't get cupcakes because my parents recognize that it makes me a crazy person, so they've created this arbitrary set of times when I'm allowed to eat cupcakes and when I'm not. You're just an adult. Like you could go eat hog wild, whatever you want. Like you're in control of this.
Yes and no. I feel like my husband would not agree to go out to dinner and lunch, which I insist on. I like to do a taco progression for my birthday. So like you go to Taco Bell for lunch and then it's like really fancy tacos for dinner. I went to Red O for dinner last year. So this year I'm going to get tacos in San Ysidro at a taco stand I've been dying to go to.
Okay.
And then I'm going to go to El Jardín and get fancy tacos.
Well,
nice little progression there.
So that sounds like a great day, but you couldn't do that on
I couldn't. I don't think so.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you have a great time.
Thanks.
And I hope your husband has a great Father's Day. And I want everybody else to enjoy their Father's Days. It's just not something for me. All right. So let's quickly clean up a couple things that happened since we last spoke to you on matters that we last spoke to you about. So we got the giggles last week.
I'm still not going to be able to get through it, I think.
We got the giggles
I can feel it coming on.
Last week. And I listened back to it. And what I was most struck by was I don't know that it was all that funny.
No, it was the funniest thing that's ever happened.
But in any case, I'm going to claim some credit. I think we deserve some credit.
Yeah,
here.
I think so.
All right.
I don't know what the other logical explanation would be.
Okay. So one of the things that we had maybe a bit too much fun with was this email that we got our hands on that was sent out by Councilwoman Barbara Bree's husband. He was soliciting his associates for campaign donations because his wife is running for mayor. And here are the two sentences that we got a real kick out of. One was, my bride, Miss Barbara Bree, is running for mayor of the city of San Diego in 2020, and putting aside my spousal affection, this woman is the absolute best choice for the city.
Okay.
He also said, quote, I have taught entrepreneurship and, quote, rational man behavior.
Rational man behavior, sure.
At 2 universities and 1 state prison. Okay. So we read those things and laughed like children.
Correct. Among other things.
Yeah. Potentially in unprofessional ways. Had, let's be honest. Let's call it is. We had a laugh at his expense.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, from the Bree campaign, that very same email went out with some small changes.
Yes.
This was also still sent out from Barbara Bree's husband, Neil Santuria. Reading those same sections, my wife, Barbara Bree, is running for mayor of San Diego in 2020, and putting aside my spousal affection, the woman is the absolute best choice for the city.
Okay.
Wife,
so that's
not
a
bride.
slight change.
And then I have started and led companies and have taught entrepreneurship at 2 universities and 1 state prison. No mention of rational man behavior.
Wow.
All right.
There you go. Hashtag impact.
Hashtag impact. So make sure we'll put that in the report for our board of directors the next quarter, that we have affected the city of San Diego in a positive direction. Okay, we also mentioned the big pension vote that was coming up this week. That vote has happened. In the briefest of detail, ever since Proposition B was approved by city voters and challenged by municipal unions, all the way up until municipal unions winning at the Supreme Court, the city of San Diego has been involved in that legal fight on the side of the proponents of Proposition B, the people who sought to reform the pension system. This week, there was a vote in closed doors to essentially flip, to change that position, and to stop attempting to defend Proposition B.
It's a big flip.
It's a big flip. Makes a big difference.
Yeah.
But
a lot of flipping happening this week.
A lot of flipping happening, yes.
We'll get into it.
But we should be clear that proponents of Proposition B will still be able to exhaust their legal defenses. They just won't do so with the assistance of the city of San Diego.
Yeah. Not everybody at the city was overjoyed at this, including the mayor.
Including the mayor, including all 3, well, I should not say 3, the 2 Republicans on the city council
right.
and 1 independent on the city council. So that has taken place. And in other flip news, and I have to be honest, just a minute ago when you said that there's been a lot of flipping happening, I wasn't smart enough to put in my head what you were referring to.
It's called foreshadowing.
Yeah, no, it's a good little device you have there. Good narrative device. Margaret Hunter, who was indicted alongside her husband, Representative Duncan Hunter, for campaign finance-related charges, has flipped. On Thursday, she changed her plea of not guilty. Specifically, she dropped the not part.
Correct. It's a change.
Yes. She now says she knowingly and willingly conspired with her husband to use campaign money to pay for personal expenses. She's now cooperating with prosecutors. Some of the charges against her have been dismissed, but not all of them, and she is still facing up to 5 years in prison.
Yeah, this is obviously quite bad, presumably, for Congressman Duncan Hunter, because, his defense all along has been that, yes, these charges happened. No one's really denied that, but that it was all just innocent mistake. He, of course, at one point blamed his wife for those mistakes that did not go over well, both with the public and now seemingly with Margaret Hunter herself.
Yeah, so that seems to have been one of those things that was both bad in the court of public opinion and also in the actual court, in that it seems to have encouraged his co-defendant to stop being his co-defendant.
Yeah.
So Now here's something that because you're smarter than me, maybe you understand. You know how they always say in the movies that you can't be made to testify against your spouse?
Correct.
Now this is a case where she ostensibly is choosing to testify against her spouse.
That's how I understand it.
Is that the legal distinction here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So this is fine. There's no sort of spousal protection that's going to play in here that we have to be cognizant of.
It's something that's reserved, for the person that it would apply to. So if she doesn't care to have that protection, then there's nothing stopping her from testifying.
Okay. So now Duncan Hunter, all by his lonesome, is still the subject of a massive conspiracy charge, basically.
Yes.
So what she pled guilty to was conspiracy.
Yes.
And she has now promised to tell the prosecution everything she knows about this situation.
Yes.
It's about her husband, Duncan Hunter,
Correct.
the representative from the East County. What do we think? What do we think about all this?
I think, I don't know, it could mean that a plea is maybe likelier if he sees the writing on the wall. Yeah, I would think that that's maybe on the table as a possibility now, if it weren't already.
So here's something our friend Rye rails against a lot. He thinks that there is a great injustice. He's not alone, but he's the person I know that talks about this most.
Okay.
That elected officials, public servants, often when charged with crimes, in the course of pleading out of those crimes, do not serve jail time, or they serve much less jail time than somebody else would, because they can offer as part of their plea to resign their public position.
Right.
And that by virtue of having a public position, they de facto get lower sentences because often the prosecutors are happy to simply get the person out of that place of public trust. And that he thinks this is an injustice because why should you literally get special treatment? You have something that you can offer to save yourself from spending more time behind bars that no one else would get. And so you're literally getting special treatment as a result of your position.
I think that we've seen that happen here a couple times, including with, part of former school board member Marty Foster's plea deal was a resignation agreement. I don't know if jail was on the table in that instance. They were relatively minor charges. But yeah, I think that's definitely true. It's a very clear victory that a prosecutor can point to.
Yeah. Often for these public, often they're coming from public integrity units.
Exactly.
That specifically are priding themselves on the ability to pull these people out of office.
Right.
All right. So then we have one other thing. This is something we've been following for many, many years. This is one of the great injustices happening in San Diego public affairs. Lincoln High is again on the search for a new leader. The school's principal and 3 of the school's vice principals were dismissed this week, the day after the school year ended. Jose Soto Ramos was the principal. He was the 5th leader of that school in the last 12 years. We also had followed when he stepped into that position that he was initially not going to be given that principal's position, and the local the community parents had really advocated for him. He advocated for himself, and it was almost begrudgingly put into that position in the first place.
Yeah, it was only after an extended search of more than a year, I think, for a principal for Lincoln last time around. They had an interim principal who had come out of retirement before Soto Ramos was eventually named principal. And before that, John Ross was in the position for 2 years. And it's just been this endless cycle of turnover. And when you start to account for all of the problems at Lincoln, I think this instability at the top, drives almost everything else.
Yeah, how do you have a direction? To people don't like the idea of saving a school.
Right.
Right. But how do you change direction of a school that has, I mean, the numbers at Lincoln speak for themselves. They've got multiples of the district average in the dropout rate, considerably higher, lower graduation rates, chronic absenteeism is off the charts. So these are the sorts of things that you could generally use as some sort of barometer about how the school's doing. How do you have any sort of long-term change of direction if you're starting from scratch from the overall leadership every 2 years?
I don't know. I mean, several years ago, when they were in the midst of a different leadership search, Mario Corran, our former education reporter, talked to a principal who helped reopen the school back in 2007. You know, it underwent this $100 million rebuild. And that person said, you know, the one thing Lincoln needs is stable leadership. And it takes years to build trust among, you know, fellow educators and parents in the community and to kind of right the ship. And so that's the one thing that they need. And that was several years ago. And it seems like it's still proving true over and over again.
All right, we'll see if they get this leadership search right. Maybe they finally find a group of people who can stick around for more than a couple years. And if you have been following the charter school scam exposed by the county district attorney's office, this story is for you. Will Huntsberry, our education reporter, laid out the characters and inner workings of the organization that's at the heart of this scam. It's a charter organization called A3. They ended up raking in millions and millions of taxpayer dollars. All right, so Sarah, this was a lengthy story, tested the limits of what we're willing to publish here at Voice. But you know, the basic rule is you got to, if you're gonna cross the 4,000 word mark, you just got to be able to keep delivering good stuff, and I think this story did. Yeah.
So the Union Tribune, to its credit, had done a lot of great reporting as this case was unfolding over the last several weeks. And so I thought they did a good job kind of setting the stage of what was happening. And what Will did is kind of step back and tell the story of how, you know, this whole organization worked according to this indictment. Remember, nobody's been convicted yet, so I suppose asterisk in that regard. But just kind of like painting these characters and how they were able to go to these, you know, like summer football camps and essentially just get parents to sign some form. And in doing so, get a lot of the state funding that is attached to those kids, even though they were doing nothing involved with the charter school. A lot of them weren't taking classes, they weren't taking programs, they were just staying in these sports programs that they'd already been signed up for, and some of them didn't even know that they were being used in this way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the central insight that the two principals in this scam who have been indicted are Sean McManus and Jason Schrock. I think their central insight was basically in the charter school system, every student is attached to a corresponding amount of money that goes with the child into the charter school system. Now, it's not 100% of what they would normally get. Some percentage of it stays with the school district that they're home to, but for the most part, this money follows them. And they said, okay, that being the case, let's go about searching for some loopholes to figure out how to get that money into our pockets,
right?
Basically,
and they got a lot of money into their pockets.
They did a very good job at running this, allegedly running this illegal scam. So they created this empire of 19 online charter schools. Now, 19 online charter schools may not seem like a lot, but one of the quirks of California education law that they took advantage of is that for a charter school, or excuse me, an online charter school, you can draw in students not just from the district that you are
authorized
in, but from any county, any district, the
entire county
in the county,
yeah,
and any county that's adjacent to that county.
Yes.
So these 19 charter schools came pretty close to covering the entire state.
Right.
Once you did this hodgepodge thing, there was it covered all of Southern California.
Right.
And then there was like another outpost up in the Northern California area that covered a vast swath of that as well. So that was one of the things that they were able to do, how they achieved this breadth. One of the other insights, and I thought, this is relatively complicated, but indulge me for a second. But the idea, the amount of money that you get goes to each student's average daily attendance.
Right.
And so if you go to school every day, then you are worth 1 unit of this funding mechanism, 1.0. If you go to 80% of the days of school, you're worth 0.8 of a unit. They realized kids could actually get more than 1 unit using this summer school and winter school situation. So a kid that had perfect attendance but then attended the summer school could actually be worth more than the one simple amount of money that you're expected to. And so they could do this. This was how they ended up creating kids who were bringing them money without even going to anything.
Right.
And so they created this network of people in these other counties that were all over the place, whose job it was to just find kids and get their parents to fill out the paperwork. In one instance, they were promising a portion of the money that they would get would go back to the youth football program.
Right.
Now, it seems to me that should have been pretty suspicious to the football coaches and parents that were signing these forms.
Yeah, I think there were varying levels of suspicion going on. There were a lot of emails, this seems too good to be true.
Yeah.
That Will unearthed.
Yeah. So, I mean, in any case, in the end, they were bringing in $14 million.
Yeah. Just obscene amounts of money.
With a system that was spending only $3.6 million. And then with an organization of shell companies in between, they were passing that money through them, and that was essentially the way they laundered it into their pockets.
Yep.
Well, in any case, go check out Will's story. It's a long one, but it really gets into the weeds of how they were able to pull this off, and I think shows that it was more or less inevitable that they were going to get caught at some point. There were just too many people involved at a certain point. Coming up on the other side of the break, we'll bring in Maya Srikrishnan to talk about her recent reporting trip to Honduras.
At the end of the show, stick around to hear from Wes Harmer. He's building a new way for seniors to live in San Diego.
All right, we are back, joined now by Maya Srikrishnan, who writes about immigration for Voice of San Diego. She has just returned from Honduras, where she's been speaking with deportees and other people who are considering migrating to the United States. She's been trying to understand a little bit more about what's driving immigration from that country here to the United States. Maya, let's start off, talk about a little bit of just the basics here. Why did you go? How did you go? What was the genesis of this project?
So I think it started last year when we started seeing these really large caravans of mainly Hondurans coming to Tijuana. I was talking with so many Honduran asylum seekers in Tijuana about why they were leaving, and I felt like I really wanted to go there and see for myself on the ground what it was actually like there and why people were coming. And so I applied for a grant from the International Center for Journalists.
Shout out, International Center for Journalists. Good organization. Thank you.
Which I was lucky enough to receive. And so I finally got to go down last week.
Yeah, and so you had a very specific pitch to the organization that was kind of an attempt to shed a new type of light based on some of the conversations you had with people in Tijuana. What was it?
So one of the things I was noticing when I was talking to Hondurans at the border was that pretty much everyone had family or at least a close friend in the U.S. And it became even clearer in October when San Diego nonprofits had to start organizing their own shelter for migrant families who were being dropped off at the border before they were going to other locations. And it became really clear that most people who were coming had somewhere to go in the U.S. and they had some connection here. And so I kind of wanted to explore the history of that and how prevalent it actually was and kind of what role it played in people's decision to come specifically to the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this was one thing that came up during when the county set up its temporary shelter, it was inaccurately being sometimes swept in together with like the homelessness crisis. And we found ourselves repeatedly pointing out, like, these people are not homeless. These people often are here for a very temporary stay. They have somewhere specific that they're intending to go to meet up with family members. And you've said that there are a few specific places that people from Honduras typically end up.
I think that the concern was that they might become homeless because they were coming here without any resources and without speaking the language and kind of unaware of how things work. So if they were being dropped off without any guidance, they might end up, homeless or as a victim of human trafficking. But yeah, when they were talking about creating the shelter, they decided not to kind of merge that shelter with homeless shelter and other resources for homelessness because most of these people were only here for a night or two before they were going to other locations. So, there are concentrations of Hondurans in several places in the country. Los Angeles is one of them, the one most close to us. Houston, North Carolina, New Jersey are just to name a few of them. Those are places where there's a big concentration. So, when I was interviewing people here at the border, that was where they were often going or where they had family. And even when I was in Honduras, most people who I talked to knew someone who was in one of those cities or one of those states. So,
it occurred to me while you were on your trip, if I were to go around even just San Diego and ask different groups of people, what the city or the country's big problems were, I would probably get wildly different answers depending on who I was talking to. Did you feel like when you were there that you encountered all kinds of different takes as to what the problems were, what the issues were?
So different people did give me different responses as to what were the primary drivers of migration. And a lot of that depended on their own experience and kind of where they were in society. So, when I was talking to economists, often they would point to poverty. If I was in certain towns where maybe violence wasn't as big of an issue, poverty would still be the main reason. But then you go into certain neighborhoods or you speak with people who work with certain populations and they will say that violence is the number one driver. So everything kind of fell within a certain framework. And so everyone would kind of agree upon the top three things. But I think it was really dependent on where you were, what your experience was. And basically those two things to decide whether it was violence or poverty is the main driver. But those are the top two things that I heard.
And so Honduras is not a particularly settled place right now at the time that you were visiting. What was the political climate like that you witnessed?
So a couple weeks before I left, protests started throughout Honduras. They started in response to a proposed reform from the government to privatize healthcare and education. And there were protests from unions in the medical field, teachers' unions, and students. But those protests were met by really harsh military and police force from the government. And so there were protesters who were tear gassed. There were reports of a lot of violence against protesters, even at least one death that was confirmed from military forces. And then when I got there, and a little before I got there, things also started to take a turn where some of the protests turned violent. So, for example, there were tires that were set on fire right in front of the U.S. Embassy. When I was there were roughly 16 vehicles from the country's energy company that were set on fire in San Pedro Sula, which is where I was. There were entire streets that were closed off for a while at night because tires were set on fire. There were lootings, but it's kind of unclear, and it seems like a lot of people think that those protests weren't the same people, like the students and the doctors who were protesting these reforms, but they were other people who were either taking advantage of the chaos or trying to behave in such a way where the protesters could be criminalized.
So when you were in San Pedro Sula and these protests were happening at night predominantly, right? It was like each night these protests would happen, or?
At night was when they would really get violent. There were peaceful protests during the day where some roads would be blockaded. There were a lot of the student protests and protests of the unions and stuff during the day, but most of the violence and the looting and the tire burning, that all happened at night generally. And
so then would you see the remnants of the evening before's, more violent actions the next day when you were walking through town?
Yes, definitely. You could see the burnt tire marks on roads that had been taken the night before. I even passed by vehicles, like cars on the side of the street that were burned during the night before. And to be honest, San Pedro Sula was probably calmer than the capital, Tegucigalpa, or some other areas like in the South Choluteca and the northern province of Colón. Those are areas where we've seen like tanks come in, and activists have been taken out of their homes, and that violence has been more prevalent sometimes during the day too.
Yeah. So during the day when you were talking to people, what was the general sense, before you get into any specific conversations you had with people, what was the general sense you got and the kind of their perception of their city and their country?
I feel like a lot of people would kind of openly say and start out with, there are a lot of problems here. There's a lot of insecurity, a lot of uncertainty right now. And a lot of people had there was a sense of paranoia among a lot of people who I spoke with. No one really knew what was going to happen on a given day. And we're kind of always wary about where they were and who was around them and what was happening, which is something that you don't really experience here very often.
Were they paranoid about you?
Sometimes. Yeah. Usually if I came with someone who they knew or we had talked before I got there, it was okay. There were a couple of times, like when I was at the bus station talking to people who were getting ready to leave, where they were really suspicious of me. I think it was really interesting to me because when I talked to migrants who are waiting in Tijuana, people tend to be more open, but when I was talking to them at the bus station right before they're trying to get to the Guatemalan border, they were really hesitant. They were in crisis at that very moment, and they were trying to get out of things, and they didn't know who I was or if they could trust me. I was at the bus terminal one night when everyone was kicked out to wait on the street because they were worried about people coming in and looting the bus terminals. And so there were probably close to 100 migrants who were just waiting on the sidewalk for their bus to leave pretty late at night. And a lot of them were women and children. And so they were very hesitant to talk to people because they didn't know why you were looking for information about who they were, where they were going. They were worried about being monitored by gang members that they were fleeing from or by their own government. It was kind of an environment where people felt like they couldn't trust anyone.
Yeah, and the sort of questions that a journalist might ask are sort of, in some ways, sound a lot like what a intrusive government bureaucrat might ask or something, right? Like,
yeah.
who are you? Where are you from? Where are you going?
Why are you leaving? Where are you going?
Are you going to Houston? Or are you going to North Carolina?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there any conversations you had that really surprised you?
So I think when I had gone into it, I had come from reporting here at the border where I had spoken to a lot of asylum seekers. And so hearing a lot of the stories about the violence people experienced and the poverty that they were fleeing, it was still grave. But I think it was kind of what I was expecting. I think some of the things that surprised me more were like the little pockets of hope, because I talked to so many people, even in the country, who would just say, there's no hope here, there's no hope here. And it's not that these people were working in something that was going to change the entire city and going to make a huge difference. But it was really interesting talking to, I spoke with a group of young people who were in their early 20s. Many of them were deportees, and some of them were just youths who were displaced from their communities in Honduras from violence. And it was really interesting because they were working in this program, and they were trying to basically create a civil discourse for youth in the country, because they felt like a lot of politicians were trying to solve problems for them, and they were the victims of a lot of the worst things about the country, but no one was really listening to them. And it was really surprising to me and really interesting to hear young people who had been affected by so many things in the country who had decided, okay, now I found this community of other young people who've been through what I've been through. We have a support system through this NGO that we're working with, and we want to stay here and try and make it better.
When we hear about people's individual stories, we don't actually often hear much about their individual stories. It's always them as the result of these big structural problems, that they're fleeing government corruption, they're fleeing gang violence. Not to say that those things don't exist, obviously, but most people also have a personal life. Did you have any conversations with anybody that just struck you as not having a great deal to do with the larger forces at play and more to just an individual's story?
There was a young man who I met with who I actually met him in Tijuana back in November when the caravan was there. And during the past few months, he has been in detention in the U.S. and he was deported back to Honduras, to San Pedro Sula, literally a day before I got there. And so we met up and we talked for a while, and it was really interesting because, you know, when he talked about making decisions, he definitely was thinking about safety, but he was 20 years old, and he also started talking about this girl who we met who was also in the caravan, and they were boyfriend and girlfriend when they were making the journey, and then they had a falling out, but now they're both back in Honduras in different cities, and she had randomly reached out to him on Facebook after he had been detained for such a long time, and kind of apologized for why they broke up and said they wanted to get back together, and he was kind of like just weighing with me, you know, like, I like her, but, you know, there are all these issues, but I also really like her, and, you know, it might be a reason for me to stay too. And it's a good reminder always, when you have conversations with migrants, that, you know, they're still human beings who are making lots of decisions, that a lot of ones that we never have to make, but they're also human in the same way that we all are.
Yeah, like that's like the most 20-year-old thing possible.
Exactly.
That's like the 20-year-old, like, I met this guy at spring break, and he goes to some college, I go to a different college,
Yeah.
You know. Thank you for coming on to talk to us about this. We'll look forward to everything you'll create based on all your time there.
Thanks, Maya.
Thanks, Maya. That was good.
Thanks, Maya.
Thanks, Andy and Sarah and Nate.
Coming up is a sponsored interview from Rachel Lang at 360 Public Affairs. Rachel sat down to speak with a developer about a new project that's trying to change the way some people live in San Diego.
I'm here today with Wes Harmer of We Strategic Development, who's working on a couple very innovative and interesting new senior living communities in Encinitas, Vista, and Carmel Valley. Thanks for joining me, Wes.
Thank you, Rachel.
So I work on a lot of housing projects in my business, and yours is definitely something new and innovative I've never heard of. And because it's senior living, a lot of us wake up in the middle of the night and we think about, what's going to happen to me, or what's going to happen to my parents or my grandparents as they age and maybe don't get around as well, or especially if they have advancing dementia. And I think a lot of us have this dread of the thought of putting our loved ones in a home, or of being in a home ourselves. And you're trying to turn that model on its head. So I want to hear a little bit about the concept behind the communities you're building and what your thinking was and how you're approaching this.
Well, years ago, I set out to look at senior living. We have 10,000 people turning 65 every day and will for the next 18 to 19 years. The necessity for senior housing is going to continue to grow. When I set out to look at this senior living and what it was truly about and what was offered out there, really everything was the same. And there were only two choices. From the East Coast to the West Coast, it was either the traditional hospital-like facility, or there was the single home board and care type of house. Both of them have wonderful advantages, but they also have disadvantages. And so looking at everything that was out there, we've created something that we feel will take senior housing to the next level, where we're able to provide a community. We're able to provide private homes in a single family home setting, but grouped together in a neighborhood with all of the with the community center and all of the amenities that one would want and expect.
So tell me a little bit. Talk about one of your projects, the Encinitas project.
We're calling it La Costa Living Estates. Uh-huh. It overlooks the Bataquitas Lagoon and the Pacific Ocean, particularly Ponto Beach. Mm-hmm. It's a gorgeous location nestled on a hilltop in a residential neighborhood.
Okay.
This will be 17 homes and a clubhouse. We will have a vanishing pool. We'll have our rose gardens, our citrus gardens, our prayer room, our prayer gazebo, a theater, putting greens, and all those wonderful amenities. In addition, we'll have 6 people in each home. We'll be able to group them together for like to like.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by like for like? Could you explain
Well, their
that?
care levels,
okay,
personalities, what their conditions may or may not be,
right,
what kind of care levels are required. This gives us the flexibility of putting everybody together.
And so you'll have 6 people per home, and is there a caretaker in the home?
Great
24
question.
hours?
We'll actually have 2 caretakers in every home. Most communities and facilities have a care ratio of 1 caretaker per 12 residents. Mm-hmm. We are going to be 1 to 5, and in some cases 1 to 3.
Wow.
So we're going to really increase the care levels,
okay,
and increase the quality of the foods, quality of activities, and give them what they would want and expect. It will be all inclusive, and we'll cover everything that they need.
Okay, well, where can people find out more about La Costa Living Estates and the other properties?
At lacostalivingastates.com.
So thanks for talking with me about this. It's a really interesting concept, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it built. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. You can check out Maya's newsletter on our site. It's called The Border Report. It comes out every 2 weeks. It'll be out this Monday. There's a link for that in the show notes. I'm Andy Keatts, assistant editor, here with Sara Libby, managing editor. The show is produced by Nate John, Adriana Heldiz, and Megan Wood. Talk to you next week.